What?
Well, sure, why?
I'm in a hurry. I don't want you boys to get in trouble with the law. Don't you understand?
If you grew up in the late 70s or early 80s, chances are you still remember this image very clearly. For millions of viewers, myself included, The Dukes of Hazzard was not just a television series. It was a piece of a golden era when the whole family could sit down in front of the TV and step together into a world full of dusty roads, car horns, and characters who felt like people we had known for years. But there is something interesting about the shows that live the longest in our memories. The more familiar they feel, the easier it is to think we already know everything about them. But behind it, there is an entire layer of backstage stories that many viewers have never heard. So today, we are heading back to Hazzard County and uncovering the most fascinating secrets behind the Dukes of Hazzard. And trust me, a few of them may make you see this series in a completely different way. Number 20. The biggest star of the Dukes of Hazzard might not have been human. When people remember the Dukes of Hazzard, the first image that usually comes to mind is the Duke boys jumping through the window of their car, laughing loudly before disappearing into a cloud of red dust. But if you look at how America reacted to this show in the early 80s, you start to notice something pretty funny. The truth is, in 1981 alone, the show received about 60,000 fan letters every month. What is interesting is that more than half of them, roughly 35,000 letters, were about one single thing: the General Lee. Viewers were not just asking about the actors. They wanted photos of the car. They wanted to know how it was built. Some people even wrote in just to say they hoped to see it in person one day. American television at that time had a very strange habit. It could turn almost anything into an icon. A catchphrase, a song, sometimes even just a hat. And in Hazzard County, it turned an orange Dodge Charger into a star the entire country could recognize in a matter of seconds. And trust me, if even a car could steal the spotlight like that, the stories behind this show get a lot stranger. And that brings us to secret number 19. Number 19. The Dukes of Hazzard was a hit the people in power did not want to admit. What? Hated it. A show pulling in millions of viewers every week. A show climbing very high on the American TV ratings charts. A show where kids copied the car horn and adults never missed a Friday night. You would think everyone inside CBS must have been proud of it. But William Paley, the chairman of CBS at the time, reportedly called the Dukes of Hazzard lousy more than once. In plain terms, he did not see it as a show worth bragging about. And if you know American television of that era, this actually does not sound that strange. The shows that the mass audience embraces the most are sometimes the very shows that make the industry's power circles frown. They feel too loud, too rural, too common to be considered respectable by people who like to imagine television should be a little more sophisticated than that. But television history has a funny habit. The things executives like are not always the things audiences remember the longest. Number 18. Daisy Duke's famous shorts once made the network nervous. In the history of American television, not many characters leave such a strong mark that their name becomes the name of a fashion item. But Daisy Duke did exactly that. Years later, people still use the phrase Daisy Dukes to describe extremely short denim shorts. But the interesting part is that from the very beginning, that detail actually made the network a little nervous. At the time, the Dukes of Hazzard was on the air. American television still had to follow fairly strict broadcast standards during family viewing hours. Daisy's shorts were seen as a bit more daring than some people in the system were comfortable with. So the production team came up with a simple solution to keep everything safe for the camera. Catherine Bach wore a very thin pair of tights underneath, allowing the outfit to keep its familiar look without crossing the censorship line. That kind of compromise was very typical of television back then, and no one on the set probably imagined that such a small detail would become a fashion icon lasting for decades. But the backstage stories of this show get even stranger than that, because one of the most important moments of the series actually began in a place almost nobody would expect: a restroom. Number 17. The two stars of the Dukes of Hazzard first connected in a restroom. Before becoming the most famous pair of brothers in Hazzard County, Tom Wopat and John Schneider were almost complete strangers when they were called in to audition for Bo and Luke Duke. According to several backstage stories told later on, the first time the two really talked was not in the casting room and not on the set. It was in the studio restroom. While getting ready for the audition, they happened to run into each other there and started chatting like two guys simply waiting their turn. They talked about music, about life, and quickly realized they actually got along pretty well. Sometimes television works in very strange ways. A short conversation in a place no one would expect can end up becoming the starting point for the chemistry between two characters audiences remember for decades. Number 16. The General Lee almost never became orange. I always thought that bright orange General Lee was a carefully planned decision from the very beginning. Like someone in a meeting room said, "This will be the color of the car." But the story behind it is actually much simpler. According to a behind-the-scenes story told later on, the first Charger they found was actually green. When the production team brought the car in to prepare it for the show, they quickly realized that color did not really stand out on camera. They needed something brighter, something viewers could recognize the moment the car appeared on the dirt roads of Hazzard County. So the car was taken to a paint shop. And according to the story, the painter simply grabbed a gallon of bright orange paint that was already sitting on the shelf and sprayed it onto the car. No big creative meeting, no complicated visual strategy, just a quick decision inside the paint shop. What is funny is that the series later referenced that detail in an episode when Cooter sprays the Duke boys' Charger with leftover orange paint. Pretty great, right? Number 15. Hazzard County's mechanic later served in Congress. There is a pretty interesting contrast in the story of the Dukes of Hazzard. On screen, Cooter is the guy always in the garage, hands covered in grease, fixing the Duke boys' cars whenever the General Lee gets into trouble again. But in real life, the actor who played him took a completely different path. Ben Jones, the actor behind Cooter, went into politics after leaving the series. And not just casually. He was actually elected to the United States House of Representatives, where he served 2 terms in the late 80s and early 90s. It sounds like quite a strange turn, but in a way, it also feels very American. A familiar face from television might stick in people's memories, but in the end, it is the voters who decide where that person goes next. And so, the man audiences once watched crawling under cars in Hazzard County eventually spent time working inside the Capitol building in Washington. Number 14. Dennis Quaid once wanted the role of Luke Duke, but with a condition: Hollywood is full of almost happened stories, those alternate paths where if things had turned just slightly differently, audiences might remember a completely different show. The Dukes of Hazzard has one of those stories. During the early casting phase, Dennis Quaid was reportedly very interested in playing Luke Duke. At the time, he was still a young actor looking for his next big opportunity on television. But there was a condition attached. Quaid was only willing to take the role if P.J. Souls, his wife at the time, was cast as Daisy Duke. That was a pretty unusual request, and in the end, it did not happen. The role of Luke Duke eventually went to Tom Wopat, and Daisy Duke was given to Catherine Bach. The rest, as we all know, became a familiar part of American television history. Number 13. The show destroyed a lot of cars, and replacing police cars was much easier than replacing the General Lee. On the set of the Dukes of Hazzard, wrecked cars were almost a daily occurrence. Every episode had chases, jumps, dirt embankments, and more than a few scenes ending with a vehicle crushed on the side of the road. But not every car that got destroyed worried the production team the same way. If a police car was damaged, that was annoying, sure, but still manageable. Those sedans were fairly common, and the crew could usually find another one to keep filming. The General Lee, however, was a completely different story. The show's signature car was built from a model year of Dodge Charger that Dodge had already stopped producing. So, the longer the show ran, the harder it became to find suitable cars to turn into new General Lees. Every time one was destroyed, it was not just losing a car. It was losing a piece of the icon audiences could recognize from a distance. That is why the production team eventually had to get creative from using miniature models for the bigger jumps to reusing older footage. Because in the Dukes of Hazzard, the car was not just a prop. It was a star the show could not easily replace. Number 12. Boss Hogg's appearance was also a trick. The moment you see that white suit, the white hat, and that very self-satisfied grin, you know Boss Hogg has arrived. But there is a small detail many viewers never notice. The round, oversized look of Boss Hogg was not entirely Sorrel Book's natural build. According to records about him, Book used costume padding to create a bigger and more exaggerated shape for the character. This was not about hiding anything, quite the opposite. It was a deliberate acting choice. Sorrel Book understood that Boss Hogg was not meant to be a frightening villain. He was more like a caricature, a man who was greedy, ridiculous, and always seemed to take up the entire room when he walked in. And American television at that time was very good at creating images like that. Just a walk, a costume, or a distinctive physical detail, and audiences could remember that character for years. Number 11. James Best once refused to film 5 episodes because the changing conditions were so bad. When people watch the Dukes of Hazzard, it is easy to imagine the set must have been a lot of fun. Cars racing down dirt roads, actors laughing loudly, constant chase scenes. It almost feels like the entire crew was part of a dusty southern adventure. But sometimes the reality behind the camera was a lot less cheerful. American television at that time moved very fast, schedules were packed, and action-heavy shows like Dukes made everything even rougher. After filming scenes covered in dirt and dust, actors often had to keep shooting almost immediately. And at some point, that became too much. James Best, who played Sheriff Roscoe P. Coltrane, once refused to film around 5 episodes because of backstage conditions he considered unacceptable. According to several stories told later on, after shooting dirty scenes, he did not even have a proper dressing room. The crew would simply spray him with water to clean him off and then continue filming. And if you have made it this far, you have just uncovered half of the behind-the-scenes stories many fans of the Dukes of Hazzard have never heard. But trust me, the things ahead get even more interesting. Number 10. Even the opening song has a TV version and a commercial release version. If you have watched the Dukes of Hazzard long enough, there is something that almost automatically plays in your head: the opening guitar and Waylon Jennings' unmistakably raspy voice singing that first line. For many years, I always thought that song only had one version, the one all of us have heard hundreds of times while the General Lee flies across the screen. But it turns out that is not completely true. The song Good Ol' Boys actually exists in 2 different versions. The version used in the opening of the series was edited specifically for television. Meanwhile, the single released commercially has a slightly different structure, and mix runs a little longer, and even the final line is not exactly the same. This is one of those small details many fans only realize years later when they happen to hear the full recording. If you are not sure, try checking it again and confirm it for me down in the comments. Number 9. The Dukes of Hazzard even had an animated version, and it sent the characters around the world. Part of the charm of the Dukes of Hazzard has always been its strong sense of place. Everything seems to revolve around Hazzard County, a few dusty roads, the General Lee Boss Hogg, and the familiar trouble inside a small southern town. But there was a moment when the Duke family's world suddenly expanded far beyond that. In 1983, Hanna-Barbera produced an animated version called The Dukes, and in that version, the story was no longer limited to Hazzard County. Bo, Luke, and Daisy take part in races with Boss Hogg all around the world. That means the General Lee, normally associated with jumps over wooden bridges and dirt roads in Georgia, suddenly shows up in places like Greece, Hong Kong, and several other international locations. It sounds a little funny, but that was also how television worked back then. When a show became popular, enough studios were almost willing to try anything to expand its world. Number 8. The famous jump in the opening credits was also a technical problem to solve. There is something interesting about film and television. The wilder a scene looks on screen, the more cold calculation usually sits behind the camera. The famous jump of the General Lee in the opening credits of the Dukes of Hazzard is a perfect example. On TV, it looks simple. The car drives up, flies through the air, and lands in spectacular fashion. But during the first attempts, things did not look that good. The car had a tendency to nose downward too quickly in midair. That was a pure physics problem. And the solution the crew came up with sounds very mechanical. According to behind-the-scenes records, they packed several hundred pounds of cement into the trunk to balance the weight, helping the General Lee stay more level while flying through the air. The result was the jump viewers see in the opening sequence, which could travel about 82 feet and reach a height of nearly 16 feet. One thing I have always liked about television from that era is how often big problems were solved in very simple ways. No computer simulations, no complicated technology, just a car, a dirt ramp, and several hundred pounds of cement in the trunk. And that is how they created one of the most unforgettable images in American television. Number 7. When the cars started running out, the show had to change strategy. During the early seasons of the Dukes of Hazzard, there was almost an unwritten rule. If the General Lee needed to jump a river or fly over a dirt road, the production would do it with a real car. And the usual result after each jump was a charger that ended up completely destroyed. But the longer the show continued, a problem started to appear. The older Dodge Chargers used to create the General Lee became harder to find and more expensive. Dodge had stopped producing that model years earlier, while the show was still wrecking cars almost every week. By around the end of season 6, the production had to change its approach. Instead of always using real cars for every jump, they began using a 1:8 scale General Lee model for certain dangerous scenes. These models were built by the effects team led by Jack Sessoms, and if you did not look closely, they actually looked pretty convincing on screen. At the same time, the show also began reusing many jump shots that had been filmed earlier. In fact, this had already started around season 2, but it became more common as time went on. Today, many fans still remember the wild jumps of the General Lee, but fewer people realize that toward the later years of the series, the Dukes of Hazzard had to move from stunts done entirely with real cars to a more careful strategy that helped keep that iconic car alive on screen. Number 6. Boss Hogg was only allowed to be cartoon evil. Boss Hogg looks exactly like the kind of man capable of every crooked scheme imaginable. He is greedy, manipulative, always trying to trap the Duke boys, and almost every episode he comes up with a new plan to make money or abuse his power. But there is an interesting detail. Boss Hogg was never allowed to go too far. When Sorrell Booke accepted the role, he placed a very clear condition in his contract. The character of Boss Hogg could not deal drugs and could not directly kill anyone. That meant Boss Hogg could be greedy, sneaky, and constantly causing trouble. But he would never cross into truly dark villain territory. Instead, he always stayed in the zone of cartoon evil, annoying, sometimes ridiculous, but still light enough for audiences to laugh at. And maybe because of that decision, Boss Hogg did not become just another enemy of the Duke boys. He became one of the most classic villains in American television history, dangerous enough, but never truly dark. Number 5. John Schneider did not just lie about his age, he almost convinced Hollywood he was a real Southern boy. Hollywood has many stories about unforgettable casting auditions, but John Schneider's story almost feels like a full performance before the cameras even started rolling. When Schneider came in to audition for Bo Duke on the Dukes of Hazzard, he was only about 18 years old. The problem was that the production was looking for someone slightly older for the role. If he had told the truth about his age, he would almost certainly have been rejected right away. So Schneider decided to do something pretty bold. He lied about his age, put on a cowboy hat, carried a beer can, and walked into the casting room, speaking with a heavy Southern accent. The way he talked, the way he stood, the way he behaved, all felt exactly like a good old boy from rural America. The funny part is that John Schneider actually grew up in New York, but during that audition, he convinced many people he was exactly the kind of Southern guy they were looking for, and that performance worked. Number 4. Production timeline from a small mid-season filler to a major series. There is a question I always like to ask when looking back at major American television series. Did the people who created them know from the beginning that they were building something huge? With the Dukes of Hazzard, the answer seems to be, not really. When production began in October 1978, the original plan was fairly modest. Warner Brothers only intended to produce about 9 episodes, mainly to fill a gap in the mid-season schedule. In other words, it was not born as a major project. It was just a small experiment. The early episodes were filmed in Covington, Conyers, and several surrounding areas in Georgia, with some footage even shot in Atlanta. Then something interesting happened. After completing the 5th episode and taking a Christmas break, Warner Brothers began reviewing the rough cuts, and at that moment, they seemed to realize the show might become much bigger than originally planned. That was when production moved to the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, California, where a longer-running production could be managed more efficiently. If Georgia gave the Dukes of Hazzard the authentic smell of a rural world, California gave it something even more important in American television: the chance to survive long enough to become part of an entire generation's memories. Number 3. The Dukes cast was a very fragile balancing act. The more I think about it, the more interesting something about the Dukes of Hazzard becomes. Its success was not just about the car, the jumps, or the dusty roads of Hazzard County. It came from something much harder to see: a very delicate balance inside the cast. If you look closely, each actor seems to bring a different piece to the puzzle. John Schneider brings the youthful energy and impulsiveness of Bo Duke. Tom Wopat provides the steady rhythm that balances the Duke duo. Catherine Bach accomplishes something not many supporting characters manage to do. She turns Daisy Duke into a cultural icon far beyond her screen time. But the real soul of Dukes may come from the veteran actors behind them. Denver Pyle James Best and Sorrel Book brought decades of character acting experience into the series. Because of them, Hazzard County did not feel like just a playful cartoon world. It felt like a town filled with personalities strong enough to make audiences believe it might actually exist. And that also explains something interesting in the history of the series. It was a very fragile balance, and if even one part shifted slightly, the entire world of Hazzard County could change. Number 2. Family-friendly TV censorship was built into the show's DNA from the start. If you watch the Dukes of Hazzard today, something feels a little strange. The show is full of chases, car crashes, broken glass, and fistfights, yet almost nobody actually gets hurt. That was not an accident. Guy Waldron, the creator of the series, once said that the real appeal of the Dukes of Hazzard came down to something very simple. It had to be a show the entire family could watch together. So instead of putting violence onto people, the show redirected it toward machines and vehicles. Police cars could fly into fields, wooden gates could explode into pieces, But human characters were rarely seriously injured. According to Waldron, Warner Brothers later pushed the series even further in a more cartoon-like direction, softening some of the rougher edges to keep it suitable for prime-time family television. In other words, the censorship of the Dukes of Hazzard did not just come from cutting things out, and that is exactly the secret that helped make Hazzard County a place viewers could return to, week after week. But that is still not the most interesting part. Right now, we arrive at the biggest secret I saved until the very end. Are you ready to discover it? Number 1. The Dukes of Hazzard was almost pitched using a homemade trailer from an earlier film. When Guy Waldron wanted to develop the series for Warner Brothers, he did not just write a concept document about 20 pages long, explaining the idea. He also did something very clever in an old Hollywood-style way. Waldron took footage from his earlier film, Moonrunners, and edited it together into a short presentation reel. A kind of rough trailer with a storytelling rhythm and narration style similar to the way Waylon Jennings would later narrate the series. In other words, he did not just describe the show with words, he let the networks see it. Today, we might call that a prototype or a visual proof of concept. But at the time, it was almost just a reel of film cut together by instinct and experience. And that is how the Dukes of Hazzard was sold to Hollywood. Not with a perfect business plan, but with a piece of footage that made people watch it and think, yeah, this could be a really fun show. And maybe that is the most fitting way to close this story. When I look back at the Dukes of Hazzard today, I always feel something very specific. This was not just a television show. It feels like a snapshot of a time when American TV was still very innocent. Cars could fly over wooden bridges, chase scenes could end with spectacular rollovers, and an entire family could still sit in front of the television and laugh together on a Friday night. It was a time when many shows were not born from perfectly calculated strategies. They grew from bold ideas, slightly risky decisions, and sometimes just a quickly edited reel of film convincing someone that we should try this. And maybe that is exactly why we keep coming back to shows like the Dukes of Hazzard. If you have memories like that too, leave a comment below and tell me which fact in today's list surprised you the most. And if you want to keep exploring the fascinating behind-the-scenes stories from television's golden era, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We still have many more trips back into the past ahead of us.